very exciting conversation with the 40th U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. What an absolute pleasure it is to have you here in India and have you here in conversation with us here on CNBC-TV18 in front of an audience of young women who are going to be charting out their course in life. And, I would typically not start with your educational qualifications, but I really want to, because what a checkered career you've had, but what a checkered past you've had as well. Harvard, Yale, Oxford, a Rhodes Scholar. How do you feel, Gina Raimondo, being back in a classroom today, here in India, speaking to these young girls?
Yeah. Well, to be very truthful, when I first walked in, I felt a little old because
that makes the two of us.
Seeing these young women, I was thinking, oh my goodness, college, you all look so young, and that makes me optimistic for our future. First of all, how exciting to be here the day after International Women's Day and Women's History Month. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to participate in the Holy celebration.
Did you have fun?
So fun. I had 3 shampoos, though, to get through the rest of my day. But yeah, look, it's really exciting and special for me to be here, I think, and to hear what a special college this is. And I would just say that so many of us have paved the way for you, and would just tell you that you have all the talent and skill and education to go forward in whatever path you choose, government, journalism, business, but do something. Yeah? Do something. Not for yourselves, but because what you have to contribute to the world needs to be contributed.
And I think that is the perfect message to send out here this morning, not just to the young women who are in this room, but to the many who are watching this program as well. But Secretary, I want to talk to you about the India-U.S. relationship, since you are here leading a large U.S. delegation. You've just met with venture capitalists and young Indian entrepreneurs. There's a thriving startup ecosystem here. A few weeks ago when that historic Air India-Boeing deal was inked, you said that this is a thriving relationship. I want to understand from you, as you sit here in India, what do you believe the future looks like as far as this relationship is concerned? What are you most confident of? What are you most optimistic about?
Yeah, well, I should say we are very optimistic overall. So that deal that you referenced was for hundreds of airplanes from Boeing, which we think and believe will lead to many more, which will create many jobs here in India and many jobs back at home in the United States. And that's just, of course, one deal. But I've just come from meeting with several entrepreneurs, women, by the way, several women who run unicorns, billion-dollar business, privately held businesses here. I think there's so much, India is already a large trading partner with the United States. We share democracy. We share common values. And I am here. I brought 10 leading U.S. CEOs with me. They're, as you say, a large delegation. I think that they're, as you said, we're hoping to enter a new era of even increased trade. And that is why we have so much optimism.
When you talk about a new era of increased trade between both sides, can you quantify that for us? I mean, what is the aspiration? What is it that you believe is the true potential, and where do you believe we could be in the next 5 years in terms of trade?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a number per se. I think, but the rate at which India is growing, I mean, by some estimates, India is the fastest growing, large economy. The rate at which you are growing, people, the group we just came from is talking about a doubling of, certain kind of business in the near term. I think that tech, there is a lot to be said for the relationships we already have as among U.S. tech companies and Indian tech companies. So I think that, and the supply, I think we're going to talk about supply chains in a little bit. I mean, I think there's just huge opportunities in what India has, not only, a billion-plus people, a large English-speaking population, a well-trained population, a stable business environment, a strong rule of law, a vibrant democracy, a long history of doing business with the United States. All of that is so important for us to build on.
You know, you preempted my question on supply chain resilience, and let me address that issue because the U.S.-India commercial dialogue has restarted after a gap of 3 years, and I'm given to understand that supply chain resilience is going to be a key focus area of the dialogue between both sides. What should that lead to? What are the outcomes that you're hopeful of from the dialogue restarting?
Yes. So we are restarting it. We'll be having a meeting tomorrow. I'll be here with my counterpart, Minister Piyush Goyal, and we'll be restarting that, again, with the feeling of optimism. Look, I think that COVID really opened the world's eyes to how vulnerable our supply chains were. And supply chains are often too concentrated in a particular geography. And so that leaves you vulnerable to not just COVID, but any kind of a natural disaster, geopolitical tensions, et cetera. And so U.S. companies, many of which I have with me on this visit, are interested to diversify their supply chains. You know, I'll give you a statistic. Last year in the United States, Ford Motor Company, the employees of Ford Motor Company making cars in the U.S. state of Michigan only worked a full week 3 times in the year.
Wow.
The reason was because they couldn't access enough semiconductors. And nowadays in cars, you know, an electric vehicle, there's over 1,000 semiconductors. They couldn't get the semiconductors even for the windshield wipers. So they couldn't assemble the car. My point is, we're not producing enough semiconductors, and we're getting them all from either just Taiwan or just packaged in Malaysia, and it exposes us to incredible disruptions. So I think what India offers is, I think India stands to gain actually quite tremendously from the move for multinational companies wanting to be more resilient in their supply chain.
You know, staying with the issue of supply chain resilience, and you talked about the semiconductor shortage, and it wasn't just U.S. companies that were impacted. Companies here in India and across the world were impacted on account of specifically the semiconductor shortage that we saw. So on that front, the U.S. has made its intention very clear to manufacture semiconductors in the U.S. The CHIPS Act has been passed. I know you've said previously that America needs to lead this, and it is America's obligation to lead this. In India, we've just announced a package to also push semiconductor manufacturing. But where do you then see the headroom for potential partnership and collaboration between India and the U.S. when both sides are hoping to manufacture domestically?
Yeah, and both can. Both can. Certainly our goal is not to be self-sufficient. You know, so, you know, for example, in semiconductors now, the United States and the world actually is overly dependent on Taiwan. 93% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. That isn't, by no measure is that stable or resilient. Yeah, now, but having said that, we never expect to make all of the semiconductors that in America that we consume. That is not the goal. And in fact, we have, and I have said this many times, a desire to work closely with our allies, including India, as we make this investment. You know, one of the dangers of any kind of industrial policy like this is you don't coordinate with your allies, you compete with your allies, and so there's a race, you know, a subsidy race, or there's a glut. You know, if Europe is considering a similar subsidy, if we all put our subsidy into the same area, you have a glut of one kind of chip and not enough of another. So the challenge here, which is it's complicated, this is a very complex situation, is, but I think women can think in like 3D, is to work with our allies to create a deep ecosystem in the United States. But also, I think there's jobs to be created in India, you know, and I think also our national security interests in many ways are aligned. And so I think it makes sense that we would work together.
And if I can just follow that up with, where is the engagement on this front with the Indian government as far as semiconductors specifically are concerned? Because as you said, it serves our interest from a security standpoint, but at the end of the day, you also don't want to end up in a situation of overcapacity, and that's something that the World Bank, etc., have cautioned countries about. So how do you balance? And it is going to be a fine balance, as you point out.
It will be difficult. So I don't want to break any news today that I'm not supposed to.
I was hoping.
But, I'm working very closely with my counterpart, and tomorrow we'll have the official meetings of the CEO Forum and the Commercial Dialogue, and we've been talking a great deal about semiconductors. And so we will have a formal discussion as between the U.S. government and the government of India around semiconductors. How do we purposefully strategize and plan? For example, India is home to a massive amount of semiconductor design talent. The United States leads the world in semiconductor design. We have a synergy there. Having said that, it's a semiconductor supply chain is incredibly complex, from rare earths, critical minerals, chemicals, silicon, actual manufacturing. So although I am not naive to the complexity, I am optimistic that working with our allies and having this dialogue will accrue to the benefit of both of our countries.
Well, you have given us a headline that there is going to be a purposeful dialogue between India and the U.S. specifically on the issue of semiconductors. Let me extend this thesis on friendshoring forward, because both you as well as Secretary Yellen have talked about that. And what do you see friendshoring extending itself to in the context of the India-U.S. partnership?
Well, once again, I think U.S. companies, many of whom I have with me, are all going through an analysis of their supply chains to figure out where there's risk. And some companies will find that they are very, very, very heavily dependent on China, for example. And there's a desire for them to diversify. And so I think that India will prove to be an excellent place, for these companies to think about investing.
Since you spoke about China specifically, there's a question that's come in from one of our faculty members here at Jesus and Mary College, which focuses on exactly that issue. Dr. Jasmine says, what is the potential for India-U.S. trade given the U.S.'s heavy dependence on China for manufactured goods? If you can shed some light on what this could mean as far as India moving up the global value chain and partnering with the U.S.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's true. Look, China still produces about 30% of global manufacturing production. India's at about 3%. The United States is 15+%. Those numbers speak for themselves. I think there's tremendous headroom for India on growing. And as I said before, you have a large workforce, well-educated, increasingly well-educated. Prime Minister Modi's investments in infrastructure, digitization, digital payments, all provide greater confidence by companies to want to do business here. It's why we come with so much optimism. And again, you cannot overestimate the value of a democracy, a strong, vibrant democracy, rule of law, court system, etc. And so I think that all of that positions India so well as a place for businesses to want to do business.
Speaking of India being the place to want to do business, and I'll ask you this in the context of the IPAF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which you've been championing and leading from the front. You've also previously said that this has been the most successful dialogues that you've had the chance to sort of steer and take forward. What makes it so special?
Yeah. So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, when President Biden came into office, he said to us on his team, the United States needs to have a proactive economic strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And I'll be very candid, for the 4 or 5 years prior to that, the United States was absent in the Indo-Pacific. You know, I said that yesterday. I had a series of meetings and dinners last night. You know, we haven't shown up. Our private sector, our governments, so we need to do that. And the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is just that. It is a coalition of 13 countries, and we're so grateful to have India participating, and all the ASEAN countries agreeing to government agreements around supply chains. There's a supply chain pillar, decarbonization and infrastructure, tax and anti-corruption, and digital trade. And we are moving forward at a speed that is kind of unprecedented. I mean, I was with the president. He announced it last year in Japan, in Tokyo. Within months, we were all together. We signed off to the negotiating statements. In fact, your minister, Minister Goyal, said he was like shocked with the speed with which we were moving. I think I'm hopeful by the end of this year.
We don't have any wood here,
There's
though.
no something here. I'm hopeful by the end of this year. We could have all of the agreements as between the governments signed up. This is my hope and goal. You know, my mother would say to me, if you have something done, give it to a busy woman. So I'm a busy woman, and I'm hoping to get this done by the end of the year. But, you know, and then once we have those government-to-government agreements, committing ourselves to high standards around anti-corruption, transparency in supply chain, environmental conditions, it will open the path to more business, private sector investment. I should tell you, in preparation for my trip here, I spoke to dozens of U.S. investors, U.S. CEOs, U.S. entrepreneurs. There is a desire to do more business here. And so when you have, for example, agreements as between governments around transparency in a supply chain or tax transparency, it just will ease the path for more investment.
You know, speaking of the path for more investment and easing the path for more investment, as you said, that U.S. businesses that you've spoken to are keen to invest more in India, either fresh investments or incremental investments. Are there any constraints at this point in time that they would like addressed?
There's always constraints. You know, there's always constraints, and I think it's on both ends, to be fair. One of the issues that you do hear from U.S. businesses, and we talked about semiconductors, India still has quite high tariffs on certain components that go into semiconductors or other electronics. And so, you know, if you have a high tariff on an input, it just makes it harder to manufacture here. We hear from investors that it would be easier. Sometimes foreign direct investment is a little bit too difficult. You know, differences as between states in India, differences as between regulation at the state level and the federal level. And to be candid, when you talk to Indian, I was just with an Indian entrepreneur, a startup company, and he said, it's hard in America. Every state has their own different rules. So, you know, I'm conscious of that. But the truth of it is, anytime, having run a business myself, anytime you can increase transparency and reduce layers of bureaucracy and regulation, it does ease the path for more commerce.
You know, you're absolutely right. I think one of the challenges that people are cognizant of and policymakers are cognizant of at this point in time is, again, finding that balance between promoting domestic manufacturing, domestic trade, and exports as well. I mean, India at this point in time, much a smaller portion of global trade. But as the U.S. Commerce Secretary, how are you treading this path between how open you need to be versus how you protect your domestic interests?
Yeah, you see, this is, of course, a very complicated question. And as I said earlier, we have no illusions that it would be a good thing to produce all that we need to consume. And having said that, as President Biden would say, the president says he's done being just the end of the supply chain. You know, the United States has to have for our national security and our economic security. You know, we are, for certain goods like semiconductors, pharmaceutical ingredients that go into our most basic medicine, even basic antibiotics, critical minerals, we have become just overly dependent on other countries. And so it is a balance. This is a constant balance between letting the free market prevail and globalization and global trade, all good things. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but also making sure that you know, there's a level playing field. I think that's such an important thing. I mean, to have a level playing field, to have labor standards, to have competitive practices, to not allow you know, anti-competitive practices, dumping, government subsidy of industries. I mean, but if you have a level playing field and certain high standards, you ought to be able to have, you know, global trade at levels which create joint prosperity. But again, I think we have just, in the United States, we took our eye off the ball of manufacturing in search of cheap labor, mostly in Asian countries, and we have to be aware of the national defense vulnerabilities that has created.